Good afternoon, at least it's afternoon here on the Mississippi River in St. Paul, Minnesota. Thank you for joining us again for another Thursday afternoon episode of Thank You for Joining Me or for joining us. Nice to have you here. Let me remind you that you'll find our social media. Let me first tell you who's going to be on the show today before we do that. Our topic today is going underground, literally. You know, a lot of us are accustomed, or most of us are accustomed to traveling in the sky, over the seas, on land, of course. My guest, Will Hunt, has spent a good amount of his adult life and his childhood, actually, underground. Here's a little biography of him you can see on the screen. He's written for just about everybody but the National Enquirer, it looks like. And you can see him at the bottom of the screen as well. He'll join us in just a moment. We are going to talk about a book, his first book called Underground. And it's subtitled A Human History of the Worlds Beneath Our Feet. And it's his belief and assertion that if we could see what was going on beneath our feet, we'd all be lying on our bellies all day watching. He has actually gone underground in a variety of places, from subways to sacred caves to sewers to nuclear bunkers to catacombs. His book is a fascinating look. And it's not just a travelogue. It is a travelogue, but it's also an amazing look at the history of things that have happened underground. We're going to talk with him about that a bit this hour. Let me just remind you, if you've missed any of our last podcasts or webcasts, or if this webcast might be of interest to someone who can't join us, it should be posted on YouTube in about 24 hours or so, and you can forward it to them then. You can follow the webcasts by going to my YouTube page, which is SavTrav49, and just sign up there and you'll get notified when new ones drop in, and you can watch, if you missed something, you can watch it on YouTube. Okay. Will Hunt, welcome to the show. Nice to have you. Where do we reach you today, Will?
Thank you so much for having me. I am in Rockland, Maine, which is a small town on the coast of Maine.
Do you live there, or are you quarantining?
I do. I live here. After 10 years in New York City, when our pandemic hit, my wife and I fled to a small town on the coast.
Boy, you're part of a trend, aren't you? It seems to be happening.
Yep.
You grew up in Providence, Rhode Island.
I did. That's right.
And I gather the first time you went underground was a cave that you found in your neighborhood. Tell us about that.
So yes, when I was 16, I discovered an abandoned train tunnel that ran directly beneath my house in Providence, Rhode Island. It was this sort of big echoing space. It had been abandoned for 25 years. And I started exploring it with friends and then started going down alone. And it just kind of unlocked something in my imagination. And I just sort of became obsessed with this tunnel and subsequently with kind of hidden spaces in general. I became someone who was everywhere I went, I was thinking about spaces out of view and out of sight. Like what mystery is just beneath my feet here.
Well, were you supposed to be in this train tunnel? Was it blocked off? Did you have to find it? Was it open? Was it? Were you sneaking in there?
I was not supposed to be there. It was trespassing, light trespassing. But it had actually been introduced to me by a science teacher at my school, who was this kind of extraordinary man named Otter, who knew all kinds of secrets about the city of Providence, and he suggested I go check it out, and I did one day.
One of our viewers has already said Lassie would have dragged you out. Okay, so you developed this fondness for going underground, and it eventually became a big part of your professional life, and you've written for numerous articles, and you've done a lot of exploration. So this is a travel show, and you are definitely, short of us ever having an astronaut on this show, probably the most unusual traveler I've ever spoken to. Let's just tell a few stories of things you've done, and then we might get the chronological history of it. But you and some friends walked a good distance for 3 days, and I think you camped out overnight. Correct me if I'm wrong. Across Paris. Do I recollect from your book that correctly?
That's right. So this is a few years ago now. A group of friends, 5 friends of mine from New York, undertook this sort of harebrained mission of walking from one edge of Paris to the other edge using only subterranean infrastructure. So starting in the on the southern boundary of the city, we slipped into the catacombs and made our way through the catacombs, and then through utility tunnels under the Seine. And from the utility tunnels, we broke into the sewers. And finally, I think it took about 40 hours. And on at noon on the last day, we popped a manhole beyond the northern boundary of the city, and the 6 of us emerged into sunlight, kind of
at a cafe, right?
Mud, yeah, just outside of a cafe, and yeah. So we camped underground for 2 nights. We had the navigating the catacombs is difficult. There's 200 miles of catacombs down there.
Hang on. There were 2 phrases you used I want to ask you to go back on.
Sure.
One was, we found our way in the catacombs. Did you have a map? And the other was, we broke into the sewers. Broke into? Let's start with found our way and go to broke into.
So, first of all, some of your viewers and listeners may be familiar with the sort of the well-trod tourist section of the Catacombs of Paris, where you pay 10 euros and can walk, for 1 mile down these alleys lined with bones. Beyond that, there are 200 miles of tunnels down there.
Oh my.
And they are the kind of the domain of these people known as cataphiles, lovers of the catacombs, who have been exploring and making art and building things and having parties down there for the last 50 years, or for much longer than that, but consistently for the last 50 years. And they have compiled maps of the entire system.
Really?
Which show landmarks and different routes you can take to get from one place to another. So we had one of the cataphile maps to help navigate, and the maps are not easy to get a hold of. You have to know people, and we were fortunate enough to know some cataphiles who were able to help us. I
presume if anyone knows people, you do. Now, what does breaking into sewers involve?
Now, so to make the transition from the utility tunnels under the Seine into the sewers, we actually had to go above ground for just a moment. So we popped a manhole from underground from the utility tunnel, sort of scampered across 1 or 2 blocks. This is like 3 a.m. in near Saint-Michel in Paris, and then popped another manhole from the surface and climbed down into the sewers. So breaking into the sewers.
Does the city of Paris encourage roaming through these, through the catacombs, through utility tunnels, through sewers? Does any city?
They do not. No city encourages it. I would say there's a spectrum of how cities think about this behavior. In New York City, where I did most of my exploring and sort of really got into this stuff, it's punishments are dire. They're very worried about they're very worried about terrorism. They're very worried about a lot of things. And I've gotten caught trespassing in New York, and it was serious, and I had to go to court. And in Paris, there's more of like a pastime, and it's still illegal. If you get caught, you can maybe get a little fine, but the culture of cataphiles is so established that you're not going to get in any serious trouble. If we had been caught that night on that expedition, we always didn't want to get caught because the expedition would have been over and they would have, sent us home. But we weren't as worried about ending up behind bars in the way that you are worried about that in New York.
If you've just joined us, I know some guests have just come in. My guest is Will Hunt. He's many things. He's a writer. He's a journalist. His first book is out. He also teaches at a couple of universities or learning institutions, I should say. He is an urban explorer, but he explores underground. And his relatively new book, his first book, is called Underground: A Human History of the World Beneath Your Feet. I think it's just come out in paperback. Is that right, Will?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So Will has, since childhood, been fascinated with what is happening beneath our feet. He travels a different way than most of the rest of us do, but boy, does he travel. His exploration, as you'll hear during the course of our chat, has taken him to Turkey, to Costa Rica, to Mexico, all over the world, going underground, including here in the United States. All right. So you were just telling us about crossing Paris by going almost entirely underground. And when you say you camp out in the sewers, there are dry places where you can sleep. I mean, to an amateur, to someone who's ever crawled through a sewer, one imagines not particularly wonderful fragrances, for example.
No, that's accurate. There are plenty of not particularly wonderful fragrances. We camped in the sewers in the catacombs. We were able to find a very comfortable place to camp. The sewers was trickier. We ended up camping on the banks of now 10 along this sort of like quiet section of the canal, and we only got like 3 hours of sleep there because a barge ended up coming down the canal, and we were afraid of getting caught, so we had to hop up and sneak back through a kind of this portal back into the stink of the sewers. Okay,
and you succeeded in doing this. You said that you really got into this in New York City, and I remember stories years ago of there being something like 15,000 people living in the subways of New York. I mean, many of them were homeless, but although some of them, I gather, live there, and that's just what they consider their home. What did you find during your years of living in New York in that regard?
So in the 1980s, there was a vast population of people living underground in New York City. The mole people is the kind of unfortunate term for them. I don't know about 15,000, but there were certainly large tunnels in New York that had hundreds of people in these kind of shanty villages underground. There's a tunnel known as the Freedom Tunnel, which runs beneath the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where there's a picture of the Freedom Tunnel. There was a pretty established town of mole people. By the time
Will, can I interrupt? But were they
Sure.
were they there out of necessity, or were they out there? Had they really developed a community there?
I think it's probably a bit of both. I think the community kind of ran the gamut of people who were struggling with drug addiction, who had some mental illness, who were just otherwise homeless, people who were kind of attracted to living off the grid. And the actual structures that they built, they had like actual homes down there, were really extraordinary. There were times when siphoning electricity down there. It was very elaborate. There's an extraordinary documentary called Dark Days, which came out in the early 90s, I believe, which anyone who's interested should check that out. By the time I started exploring in New York, those days of the Mole people. The tunnel where they were living had been taken over again by Amtrak, so there were trains running through there. There were, however, a handful of kind of leftovers mole people who had not left when everyone else was sort of evicted by the trains, and who had retreated into the eaves of the tunnel, and had stayed in their homes. I had a couple encounters with them down there, but a couple of friends and I once attended a birthday party for a woman named Brooklyn, who had been living in the tunnel for 28 years.
28 years.
According to her count. And she was living there with her partner, who, against all odds, was also named Brooklyn. And they, she was extraordinarily charismatic. I think she was struggling with some drug addiction or mental illness, but she had been in a lot of documentaries because the story of the Mole people was very famous. And so, film crews from around the world would come visit her down there. So she, during that night, she kept referring to herself as a movie star, which was pretty great. And I think she has since left. Last time I was down there was no sign of her, but she, an extraordinary woman.
Are there animals down there? I presume there are rats. Are there alligators? I mean, what do you find down there?
I haven't seen any alligators. There are rats. I spent a lot of time running through the subway tunnels where there are certainly rats. But again, rats need things to eat. They need human activity around them. So in the Freedom Tunnel, for example, there weren't enough people and enough scraps of food to support a rat community. So we weren't seeing rats down there. We ended up sleeping that night in the tunnel, kind of on Brooklyn's doorstep, and didn't see any rats.
All right, let's change the focus of your exploration to let's first of all talk about the underground, the history of underground. I was taking some notes from your book. You talk about Celtic seers, Tibetan monks meditating in mountain caverns. The shamans of Native American tribes would go to caverns to embark on vision quests. The mystics of the Wolof culture in Senegal, Marut shamans in Malaysia. In ancient Greece and Rome, the oracles always delivered prophecies from underground. And this one, that apparently when you go on a tour in Israel, Moses got the 10 Commandments while underground? I always thought he was on a mountaintop somewhere.
So apparently, I haven't done this, but there is in that passage of the Old Testament refer to, I forget the precise wording, but they refer to a hollow in the rock, and apparently when you go up on Mount Sinai, they point to a cave, which is apparently where Moses went to hear the voice of God.
But there are reasons, and you tell us about many of them, that seers and shamans and mystical folks find their place underground to be where they need to go to be who they are.
Yeah, so this was kind of the big discovery for me, the big kind of revelation in this whole, years-long obsession. I guess after spending many years running around in tunnels in New York and then in Paris, I became really curious about why was I so fixated on these spaces, and why throughout history have we had this really deep connection to caves and other dark holes in the ground. And what I found through going deeper and deeper into history was that throughout the world, there's this universal belief that when you step through the mouth of a cave and into what scientists call the dark zone, you are kind of leaving the normal plane of reality and entering the spirit world or the land of the dead, or you can give it any name, but it's universal. It's not just in one place. It's everywhere. And you just rattled off a couple of them, and that's even an abbreviated list there. It's a completely universal thing. And my sort of discovery over the course of this book was or my theory, I guess, is that we still have vestiges of that relationship. I mean, in the modern West, we may not look at the mouth of a cave and say, okay, that's the mouth of the underworld or whatever. But when we're climbing into a deep and dark place, we're entering a place where the kind of the sensory experience is so utterly different from anything we're familiar with, and entire portions of our nervous system are being suppressed. We're sometimes hallucinating. The oxygen is low. We're hearing echoes that we don't hear on the surface, and what may have felt to our ancestors like an actual physical travel to a separate realm is, at least to us, a really striking sensory experience.
Well, you said that these are environments that led to mystical visions, to religious experiences, perhaps. There's certainly nothing, like where I'm living right now. There are all kinds of things. I could go watch TV. I can read a book. I can, I can do yoga. You're in a dark place, and as you say, it's a whole different sensory reality. And I can see if you spend some time there, things in your mind might happen.
Very much so. I became fascinated with this specific, idea of entering the dark zone of a cave in order to undergo an altered state of consciousness, and decided to do a little experiment on myself, where I enclosed myself in a cave in West Virginia, alone for 24 hours in complete cave darkness, just to see what would happen. I'd been reading about what all these mystics and seers and shamans were doing, and I wouldn't say that I heard the voice of God or traveled to a separate realm, but there was a moment where I started to hallucinate. I started to see dots in front of me that weren't, I was going to say they weren't there, but in a sense they were there. And it's the kind of experience that, again, to our ancestors, they might have interpreted that as a message from a deity, but for me, it was like an aberration in my sort of sensory apparatus, and it was still very powerful. This is something I don't experience in normal reality on the surface. But yeah, it was just. But I emerged recognizing just how powerful this landscape was.
I noticed you call it on the surface. I think most of us would say above ground. You've used the phrase
ground, yeah,
on the surface quite a bit. Your travels took you to Mexico, and there were some. You came across some incredible Aztec. I don't know what to call them. What would you call them?
Maya.
Oh, the Maya. Excuse me, yep. Maya. Right. I'm sorry. Maya.
Oh, that's okay.
Right. been a while. I haven't read the book in 2 weeks. It's a Maya. No, I mean well, describe the Maya underground world.
So, the part of the world that we know as Mesoamerica, which is sort of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, is absolutely just loofahd with caves. There are just caves everywhere, holes in the ground of all kinds. And we know through archaeology and also through anthropology and also from the Maya people living there today, that every single one of those holes in the ground was a portal to the other world, to a spirit world. In Maya belief, they called it Xibalba. So I spent a lot of time, and remember, I'm already kind of fascinated with the kind of mystical power of these spaces, at least the historical mystical power of caves. So this is kind of like the Mecca for me. So I spent a lot of time in the jungle of Belize and throughout the Yucatan Peninsula, exploring with archaeologists who knew all these caves, and we would go deep underground, sometimes swimming through the dark through these long kind of winding subterranean rivers, which, to speak of sensory experiences, is just the most otherworldly feeling you can imagine. To be floating, to be in pitch darkness, floating in a river, is something extraordinary. But at the very end of these caves, we would get to the very last chamber, and there would be remnants of rituals, of ceremonies conducted underground, including human skeletons,
human sacrifices.
Yes, so evidence of human sacrifices, full skeletons, skulls. There were animal skeletons as well, and pieces of precious stone, jade, that were brought underground to as gifts to a deity. In this case, it was archaeologists there have done this amazing kind of detective work to figure out that there was a spike in subterranean rituals that aligned with a drought, and it was because the rain god lived in caves. And so to appease the rain god, to beg him to bring rain, they would climb deep into the caves and perform human sacrifices as a way to end the drought.
You also, when I think of NASA, I think of rocket ships going up into the rocket ship going up, missiles going up into the sky. But you went out west and found some NASA folks. You called them NASA astrobiologists.
Astrobiologists.
And they were going a mile below the surface in an old gold mine. What were they looking for?
Yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to do with this book, and one of the things that just I fell in love with about the underground on a kind of intellectual level, beyond just loving crawling through tunnels and caves, was that the underground means so many things simultaneously. It's like a place of death. It's a place of treasure. It's a place of refuse where we're burying our waste. But it's also throughout mythology. It's a place of birth. It's an origin place. And I became totally fascinated with this group of NASA astrobiologists who were working in at the bottom of a gold mine in South Dakota, who were finding very ancient bacteria living deep underground in a place where we not so long ago believed that no life could survive. And they were, I had the chance to go visit with them and go down to this and kind of help them take samples of water coming out of the walls that were just teeming with these bacteria. And their mission, part of their mission, was to they believe that the kind of life that they find at the bottom of this mine might be similar to the kind of life that could exist on Mars. So that was their kind of long view.
We have a picture of you here, Will. I think in your outfit, and it's the caption is SURF, SURF. Does that stand for something?
It does, and you're putting me on the spot, and now I can't remember. It's Sanford Underground Research Facility.
Okay, and that what I'm looking at in the background, that's all underground?
That is a mile underground.
I mean, it looks like it's a sophisticated laboratory, on the surface of the Earth.
So it's SURF is there's a lot happening at SURF. So part of SURF is this kind of nuclear physics, particle physics laboratory that's deep underground, and it's one of the nation's premier particle physics labs. And it's you get on this elevator into the lab, and it's like being in a you wouldn't know that you were underground. Apart from that is the kind of the wild part of the mine, which is where I was with these the astrobiologists, where you can feel the pressure of being underground. You can feel the heat. It's just a very intense environment, and remarkable to learn that it's teeming with life.
How many people are working underground there?
Oh my goodness, a lot. I wouldn't be able to give you an exact number, but when I was there, they gave me a little tour and dressed me up in this suit, and I probably saw like 20 major particle physicists down there.
I got to say, you don't read a lot about this work.
It's pretty interesting work. It's something you see all over the world, actually, repurposing deep subterranean space for particle physics laboratories. And I'm no expert, but I think basically it's a way of, the deeper you are underground, the less the fewer kind of radioactive particles get underground, so there's less noise.
I see. And you said these guys were also
examined.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
You also said, Will, that you said they were looking for bacteria that might resemble something that might be found on another planet, but they're also living creatures. They're called troglobites. I learned from your book, that are underground, that could be millenniums old.
That's right. So I went to go to join these astrobiologists who were looking at these creatures who were living deep underground.
Little guys,
very little guys. Tiny wriggling things that you can't see without a microscope. But they're everywhere. It's teeming. It's like there are estimates that there's actually more. By biomass, meaning if you took all the life on the surface of the Earth and put it on a scale, and you took all of the life under the surface of the Earth and put it on a scale, there's more life underground than above ground.
That is incredible.
It is incredible.
I mean, elephants weigh a lot. I'm sorry to be very statistic, but a troglobite, if you have to look at a microscope, that is phenomenal. Let me just interrupt. This is very quick. Wayne asked, can you do what you call spelunking? I don't think so. Isn't spelunking looking, or is it?
Is this spelunking is just exploring a cave. So anytime you go into a cave, you're
in a way you're doing that, but you're taking spelunking to a whole nother level.
Yes.
Sure. Let's go back to these troglodytes. What do they live on? I mean, there's not a lot of oxygen down there. There's no plants to eat.
Well, there's not a lot of oxygen. There's not a lot of what we would think of as food. They're eating the rocks. That's the very kind of dumbed down way of saying it. And I that's how, as I understood it, they're just able to survive in ways that we don't think of life as being able to survive, which is why they're being used as models for potential extraterrestrial life. I call them the intraterrestrials, but I became fascinated by the work of these deep dwelling creatures, because there's a theory that they are the oldest creatures on Earth, that life began underground rather than on the surface. The old theory we've always had is that life began on the surfaces of a kind of a warm pond, the primordial soup. And there's this theory going around, and it's becoming more and more viable as they find more and more life deep underground. That these are actually, we're all descended from these underworld dwelling creatures. And it was especially exciting to me because just down the road from this lab in South Dakota, this is in the Black Hills of South Dakota, is a place called Wind Cave, where the Lakota people tell the story of their creation, which is that the original creatures, the original people, lived deep underground and slowly made their way to the surface and slowly colonized the surface of the earth, emerging through the mouth of Wind Cave. So the Native Americans and the NASA astrobiologists are telling the same story in the same place, in one speaking in myth and storytelling, one in the language of science. That
is stunning. I know you did go with the Lakota Indians. Yeah. What took you to Turkey?
Oh goodness. So in the heart of Turkey is this place called Cappadocia, which is
all caves, right?
it's just full of caves, full of caves, under cities. So throughout this entire region, you have a scatter of kind of modern villages. Beneath every single one of those villages is a sprawling underground city, and the largest ones go down 13 stories and have space for thousands of people.
Wait a minute. Wait. I have never been to Cappadocia. I knew I've seen pictures of the caves from the outside. Some have hotels in them and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. 13 stories. When were these built?
They were built, they were built going back to, the first ones were built kind of by the Hittites, I think, and I don't have my historical timeline in front of me, but 3,000, 4,000 years ago. The thing that's weird about trying to do archaeological research on these underground cities is that they were expanded upon by each culture that came into that region. So the Hittite people would dig one level, and then the next people would conquer them and then expand. So we only have evidence of the latest people who lived there.
But we're talking shovels and getting earth up to the top. I mean, getting it out of there. We're not talking backhoes and conveyor belts and trains on tracks bringing debris out.
It's pretty extraordinary. It's mind blowing. And I went there because I was fascinated with with digging, the idea of digging for safety. Again, I was talking about how the underground is used in all these different ways and means so many different things, and something we've done forever is to dig underground in order to protect ourselves in times of danger. And I spent some time looking at the Cold War history of the United States, where in the late 50s and early 60s, there was this rash of people building bomb shelters in their backyards, and it was a totally normal thing to invest in a family bunker.
Right.
And I mean, of course, it's still going on today. There are plenty of bunkers out there, personal bunkers. But capital the map for personal bunkers. Those are all they're architectural marvels, and on one level you walk through these spaces and you're just astonished. On another level, they're kind of terrifying spaces. When you think, it takes a little bit, but when you look at a 13-story deep bunker built by these ancient civilizations, you end up thinking about what they must have been afraid of on the surface. And there's Cappadocia, because of where it's located, is at this sort of crossroads of the Silk Road, and it was a very strategically valuable place. And so they were constantly being invaded, and they must have been to dig something like that. They must have been terrified. So it's kind of sobering to think about it that way. Yeah.
Well, my first thought is, I mean, if somebody starts pushing dirt down there, you're in big trouble. I mean, at least if you're above ground, you can run somewhere. Perhaps they had escape tunnels. I wouldn't be surprised.
There apparently, and I say this with a little bit of a caveat, which is that when it comes to subterranean space, people always exaggerate. So it's hard to get any true scale. But apparently there were underground cities that were connected one to the other, like a system sprawling for miles.
Okay.
So a village would be under attack, and all the people would retreat underground, and they would roll a big millstone in front of the entrance to where no one could get to them, and then they would escape to a separate town. Apparently, there are a lot of mysteries down there, and there's not a lot of funding for research. So there's just a lot of things we still don't know about what's going on in Cappadocia.
Well, we can't let you go without talking about Egypt and Luxor. Well, here you are in Luxor. Yeah. Again, I know there are caverns. I mean, there are, archaeologists keep finding things there. But what was your unique take on Luxor and Egypt?
Well, so it's interesting. The Luxor work is not in underground, but it's in a book that I'm working on now, and I became fascinated with Luxor. Well, I fell in love with just the tombs. I was down in Egypt looking at different types of subterranean environments, and just fell in love with visiting these ancient Egyptian tombs that had beautiful paintings on the walls. I was down there for a few weeks and started learning hieroglyphs, and I just was in heaven. I was so happy. While I was down there, I learned of a village of people of modern Egyptians on the west bank of Luxor, where all of the the Valley of the Kings is there. All of these, it was the kind of the grand cemetery of Egypt. There was this village who, for 400 years had been living on top of and sometimes inside of these like very valuable tombs. And they had, when Europeans started to, travel to Egypt in order to bring antiquities back into museums in, Paris and London, they encountered these local people who were, poor, living in the desert on the banks of the Nile, but knew all the tombs. They knew where all the tombs were.
Mm-hmm.
So it began this very strange relationship where you would, if you're a British explorer and you want some valuable things for the British Museum, you go and kind of ask the people of Kurna, this is the village is called, to like lead you to some tombs. So they helped. They were, and then of course, as they recognized that there was a lot of value to what was in these tombs, they started to help themselves. This unfortunate, but recognizable story unfolded where the white people bringing the antiquities back to Europe were, archaeologists and scientists, and the Egyptian people who were, dirt poor and stealing objects from tombs. They were the thieves.
Right.
So I just became fascinated with that story. I ended up spending a lot of time with the people of Kurna, including one particular family, the Abd el-Rasul family, who made some of the biggest discoveries in the history of Egyptian archaeology, and then were called thieves.
Yeah, there's cultural looting, and then there's the locals who just sort of live there, right?
Exactly.
So you've gone to some very exotic places. For those of us who are total amateurs in this, there are places, the catacombs in Paris. I read today, I sent you a clipping that the postal train that used to run for 75 years under the streets of London between two large post offices in different places is reopening the end of October. And you can actually take the postal trains. Now they shifted mail under London because the streets were so crazy and there was traffic and people and mud, and they actually crosstown mail service underground, and you can now ride that train. Chris says she saw a video once about an annual marathon held underground in an old salt mine in Germany. You ever heard of that one?
No, but I'm not surprised. The salt mines throughout Europe are vast, and there's always strange things happening in them. That's really cool. I didn't know about that.
Really? Now, are you still out there exploring? Are you still looking for action?
COVID. The short answer is yes. Not in the last couple months, certainly, but I'm, I one of the benefits of having written a book about caves and having spent a lot of time talking to archaeologists and people all over the world about caves is that I get assigned stories about caves. So even if I wanted to get away from this, I probably couldn't. So I was just doing. Since the book came out, I spent a lot of time in the southeast of the United States exploring what are known as the unnamed caves, which are throughout Tennessee and Alabama and Kentucky. And they contain just extraordinary Native American artworks that are relatively unknown to most Americans, it seems, but are very special.
I'd never heard of them. You talk about artwork, and obviously they're painted in the caves of Luxor. I guess now in the southeast United States, which I didn't know. I'm sure out into the Dakotas, the Indians had artwork on their caves. But one of the first pictures we put of you was in the subways of New York, where there was graffiti. and there was also a sculpture of a man sort of emerging from the rock. It does seem to be a place where artists are inspired, and you've seen, I presume, a lot of art underground. I presume you consider graffiti art of our time. You also say that there have been symphonies underground. There were lavish dinner parties with candelabras and gourmet food. Who does your wife join you on these, or does she think you're crazy?
She has joined me on a lot of cave expeditions. She's from Paris, and she actually hasn't joined me into the catacombs.
Just don't tell me you met her in the sewers of Paris, because that would be.
I met her on the surface, above ground.
Well, it's just a fascinating look at what's beneath us. I mean, I do sometimes walk in big cities and I think, how do they get the water to those skyscrapers up top there? How do they get the Wi-Fi or the fiber cables and the phone things and sewers and, water going up, waste coming down? There is, when you occasionally you'll see a cross section of a land in New York underneath the surface, and they're here all these wires and guards, and there's subways. I mean, it is a fascinating world under there, but I have never, ever, until reading your book and talking to you, considered so much the cultural implications and the spiritual inspirations, perhaps, of things underground. I really, as I said to our folks who tuned in early, this book called Underground, subtitled A Human History of the World Beneath Our Feet. This is not just, and then I went underneath, I walked under Paris, or, I met some subway people. This is a serious, I don't want to say academic, because it could be, but it's very anecdotal. It's a look at a world that a lot of us have no idea exists. And Will Hunt, I thank you. I thank you so much for writing it.
Rudy, thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure talking to you. I had what you're saying makes me think of a friend of mine who is a character in the book, who kind of helped me start exploring in New York. His name is Steve Duncan, and he's an evangelist for recognizing subterranean space. And he said his dream is to make every manhole in New York clear, see-through, so people could pause in the street and peer underground. And I think sort of this book is written in that spirit. It just helps people think about what's hidden beneath their feet, but just hidden. I want readers to recognize always that the world is deeper and stranger and more mysterious and more full of wonder than they recognize.
And I think years ago I talked to somebody whose hobby was going underground, not as serious as yours. And I think he told me that there are these, I'll put it in quotes, secret maps that people have put together of underground New York, underground London, underground Tokyo, in major cities all over the world. True?
Certainly in Paris. It depends on the city. What's interesting in New York, there really is no map of the underground, not even an official map. It's too vast and entangled and confusing down there. So there's no official map of the underground of New York City, which is always something that I loved. But in a lot of other places, there are, these urban explorers, these underground people, know things about their cities that other people do not, and that's true everywhere.
Well, one viewer, Ronald Harris, reminds me of the Seattle underground tours. They're not as massively as extensive as some of the things you've been prowling around in, but you can go to Seattle and see the Seattle that's under Seattle.
Absolutely. I haven't been out to Seattle to do that, but there are, in almost any city of any age, anywhere in the world, there will be first of all, ground infrastructure that's interesting, and second of all, probably a public tour that can bring you underground, and it's amazing how it can kind of reconstitute your relationship to your home. My discovery of the train tunnel under my home in Providence, Rhode Island is the perfect example. Like this was the place I knew best in the world, and I discovered the most kind of otherworldly place directly beneath it, and my whole life shifted as a result.
Well, we're ending where you began, in the abandoned railroad tunnel in Providence. Will, thank you for joining me. I just want to say to those who are online, stick around for just a couple minutes. I want to talk to you about going to London last week, because I got 7 people asking questions about whether I went into quarantine or what it was like going and so on. I'll tell you in a moment. Meanwhile, Will Hunt, the book is called Underground. It's a great read. It'll open your world. I mean, it's a kind of travel that most of us don't do and don't even imagine doing. But Will did it, so we don't have to, if you want to look at it that way. Will Hunt, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you, Rudy. This was a pleasure.
Appreciate it.